Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is looking at solar development, planning for an increase, and how the UK can do this, and how developers can efficiently deliver their projects. My name is Howard Waples. I'm a director at a specialist SME company called Temple. I focus on environmental sustainability planning projects, and I'm delighted to welcome today three very well-recognised industry professionals: Sophie Orme, Kirsty Lodge and Robert Miles. I'll introduce the three of them in more detail just prior to each of their sections. What we're planning to do today is have 10-minute sessions from each of the three speakers, followed by a bit of a Q&A session at the end. If you would be kind as to add any questions you might have to the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll cover those as we go through. So as a little bit of an intro, the Energy Security Strategy, published only in April 2022, identified that there was 14 gigawatts of existing solar capacity in the UK, and emphasising how the cost has fallen by 85% in the last decade. And at the time, the government expected a five-fold increase in deployment of solar by 2035, and they were planning to consult on strengthening policy in favour of development on non-protected land, particularly that that's been previously developed. So fast forward to recent events under the Liz Truss government, and latest seeming to be that land use definitions frameworks are set to potentially change, with agricultural land of value 3B, I believe, now potentially being categorised as best and most versatile land, and therefore potentially not available for solar development. So all this seems quite at odds with the government's position merely 6 months ago. And to hopefully wrestle with this perceived uncertainty, I'm delighted to say welcome the three panelists today, and try and make some sense of what's going on, really. First up is Sophie Orme. She is a commercial director at RHE Energize, a high-density hydro solution enabling the energy transition. Sophie has 16 years of clean tech experience, leading the deployment of solar, wind and energy storage assets, from first of their kind applications through to utility scale. She was the renewables and energy storage lead of Centrica's pioneering Cornwall local energy market, which highlighted the role of flexibility markets and policy changes need to enable 100% renewables on the grid at the lowest cost to consumers. Sophie holds an M.Eng in aerospace engineering and studied business sustainability management at Cambridge. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Howard. That was a meaty introduction. Right, let me just check the screen is sharing. One moment. Okay, can you see my first slide?
Yeah.
Right, yeah, I'll introduce myself and what Re-Energize does as well. Yeah, so I'm commercial director at Re-Energize. We're based in London and Montreal. And today I'm going to run through the challenge of eroding capture prices. So not so much the land, but what happens to prices as solar penetration on the grid increases. And what the opportunity is for medium duration energy storage. That's between about 4 and 12 hours, and how that should be a really good mitigation tool to capture the higher prices as the sun starts to go down. So I'll explain who Re-Energize is and our aim to facilitate massive growth in zero carbon renewables, particularly co-located with solar. So just my sort of pitch that I'm from the solar world. I started at Solar Century in 2004, and I was there for 14 happy years. Joined when they were a startup and solar was very expensive and very niche, through to utility scale. And that project on the left looks pretty small and pretty well spaced out. It was actually the first greater than 1 megawatt system to be connected in the UK. And it was my first large project that I oversaw. And then I remember the next wave of 5 megawatts systems as the feed-in tariff took up, and larger. And then more recently, I've got involved in energy storage. And I was just filming in the top right there when we installed a flow battery, which had 12 hours storage, and that was behind the meter at a holiday site. And it was taking energy from their ground mount solar system. So that was a great experience. So I'm really passionate about renewables, and I invested in Re-Energize 2 years ago, believing they may well have the key to unlock 100% renewables on the grid. And I've recently joined them as commercial director. So first of all, explaining what we do. So our solution is based on pumped hydro, where effectively liquid is pumped up a hill during times of excess renewables on the grid, and it flows down the hill when prices are high, and the flow of that liquid drives turbines in the powerhouse at the bottom. What Re-Energize has done is develop a high density liquid, which is about 2.5 times the density of the water for use in our system. This means we only need relatively small hills to generate the same amount of power. So we leverage everything that is great about traditional pumped hydro, but we make it scalable. And I'll come back to that later. But first of all, I wanted to dive into some scary graphs. And these may well be familiar to those online today. And just explaining how cannibalization and the capture prices will become a challenge as we get more solar on the grid. So because of the marginal pricing method, when renewables injected onto the grid, the spot prices tend to go down. Because it's a low marginal cost technology, basically there's no fuel costs. So the system operator will give priority dispatch to them and will need less of the more expensive energy generated by other technologies like gas, labeled on here as CCGT. Therefore, the average price for the particular slot when solar's generating will fall. The graph at the top left, we see the price peaks in the morning and evening. Interestingly, the peaks in demand are less pronounced because it's the increased generation of solar and wind causing those prices to dip. Bottom right, we can see the generation mix for that day. The gas is largely tracking demand, but we see the solar peak and the increased wind pulling the prices down. Just going to the next slide. So the cannibalization effect is really clearly seen here. And we can see from other markets where there is much higher solar penetration, like Germany, Italy, certain states in the US, the pricing volatility is more pronounced. Increasing a project capacity relative to the grid increases the shoulders, but that can only go so far. And the shoulder capture prices will also decline, though not to the same extent. So to increase the capture prices, which we all want to keep the rates of solar installation going, the dispatch shape of the project will need to change so that the higher prices can be realized. And the only way we think that can really be achieved so that the owner is control is by the inclusion of energy storage. And I just took a snapshot of yesterday's energy mix at around lunchtime, and it was pretty overcast here, but solar was still contributing 12% of the mix. Just going to the next slide. This graph from the US is showing wind and solar value capture declining over time. Modeling key markets in US with high solar, ERCO is the Texas market, and Casio is the Californian market. And they've shown that a storage duration of at least 4 hours, preferably more, is needed to capture the higher prices. So storage can help change the apparent generation profile of solar, including hours when the sun goes down. So which storage solution? This is a graph by the consultancy Jacobs. That we know that lithium-ion battery prices have been tracking down, much like solar did, but this doesn't endure as we increase duration. And if we want to really capture those increased solar prices, you need applications of at least 3 hours. And that's when lithium-ion batteries, as you see the graph going up, aren't the best fit. Jacobs uses a metric called cost of firm generation. And this looks at electricity input costs, operational costs, efficiency for each technology to create a cost of firm dispatchable generation. And this shows that pumped storage is consistently the lowest cost solution by some margin. And we're also tracking our solution there. And I'll explain with the next slide why we leverage all the benefits, well, not the next slide, in a couple of slides, but we leverage all the benefits of pumped hydro. But because of our higher density, we do so at lower costs and in many more places. So just going back to pumped hydro, and looking at what we need to decarbonize our power grids, globally, it's predicted we need 2,000 gigawatts of storage by 2040 at around the 6 to 12 hour duration. And this is 10 times what's been installed today. And in all energy storage around the world, about 95% of it is made up of pumped hydro. Now, traditional pumped hydro is low cost, but the principal problem is it's not scalable. They need mountain ranges, and effectively most of the best sites have already been used. And those sites tend to be long distances from consumers and distributed grids. With our re-energize innovation, projects can be installed on relatively small hills. We're scoping for projects for elevation drops around 75 meters to 300 meters. And that translates to a range of around 5 megawatts at that lower elevation to multiple 10 megawatt systems. So we can scale up on, let's say, a 200 meter elevation hill to 50 megawatts, potentially 100 megawatts, if that's where the need is, just running our turbines in parallel and our pipes. Just going back to explaining how our system works, we've developed an environmentally benign fluid with 2.5 times the density of water, and we call that R19. This means that our elevation is smaller, and it means there's several orders of magnitude more sites. Alternatively, projects can be smaller, and that's where I see the huge opportunity, particularly in the UK, where you have a solar farm adjacent to a hilly area. So we've done our GIS studies, and in the UK alone, we've identified over 6,000 sites and over 100,000 sites in Europe, and beyond there's more and more. And if in the UK only 330 HD hydro projects were realised, that's 25% of the UK's predicted 2040 storage needs. So just where we are, we're growing at the moment. We're doing our testing in Montreal. We just installed a demonstration site there, and then we're installing a larger site pilot in Plymouth at a mining site. So we're behind the meter, and we're looking at linking that up with new solar. And we start our build in that in May. So that's my presentation. I just wanted to inspire the opportunity of co-locating storage and the need for the longer duration storage. for that to be a real opportunity as you look at your development portfolios going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. That was really interesting. I've certainly got a couple of questions I'd like to ask at the end.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. On to the next speaker, Kirsty Lodge. She's a principal planner at Enzo Energy. She's got over 9 years' experience in delivering energy projects, and Enzo Energy is one of the leading developers of renewable energy projects in the UK. So over to you.
Lovely. Can you see my presentation?
Can indeed, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us today. My background is planning, so I'm going to focus on the planning side of delivering towards net zero. Obviously, there's a lot in politics at the moment, and I think it'd be interesting for us to have a discussion about that at the end. So I'm going to focus on 5 key topics here: site selection, engagement, good design, planning process, and then what those opportunities are that I foresee within the planning system to really sort of push us forward into where we need to be. So the first one is site selection. So it goes without saying, grid connection is a really key point in delivering solar sites. If you haven't got a grid connection, you haven't got a scheme. There's a lot that goes into securing grid connections. That can be through national grid or district network operators. Different developers have different approaches for that. Obviously, a site needs to be close to the point of connection, otherwise you end up having transmission losses, and it avoids all the additional impacts that brings in terms of from a construction perspective. Planning considerations. So what we generally do at Enzo is we've got secured our grid connection, and then we start to do a search within that area of all the planning constraints. That should include not just destinations, but also local planning allocations. That can be for residential, or it can be for other allocations within the local plan. We then start to look at what land's available within those areas that aren't constrained by designations. Look at the ownership, what's the current use, what's its suitability for solar. And then we start to look at the connectivity of those sites and how easy it is for us to get from A to B. Now, this for me is the biggest hurdle I think that we've got within the industry at the moment, and that's engagement. Obviously, it's already been mentioned around the BMV arguments that are going on at the moment, and food security, and now looking at 3B being included as best and most versatile. And I think there's a real piece that we can do within the industry from a developer's perspective, as well as from a consultancy and a local authority perspective as well, where engagement really needs to be quite key. Now, for me, it always starts with the local communities. Going out there, engaging with them, and most importantly, educating. There's a lot of myths around solar energy, and we see that at pretty much all of our public exhibitions that we hold. And it's really important as an industry that we educate on those things and don't let Google searches take over and cause people to think that solar is a terrible thing, and we shouldn't be doing it within this country. I think we really need to be careful with the level of engagement and the type of engagement that we do. Now, COVID provided us with a great platform, which introduced webinars using Zoom like we are today, and also Teams. Now, that was brilliant during COVID. It provided us with a platform. It didn't halt development from going into the planning system, which was great. But I think now that we're sort of moving away from those restrictions, we really see the value in going to local halls, village halls, churches, going and sitting there and just talking to people face to face, and having that engagement and giving them that time seems to be a more productive, in our view, way of engaging with the local community. I think webinars definitely have their place, but they do pose the risk of running a platform for people who might not necessarily have the effort to go and want to see you in person, but use it as a platform to really air their frustrations around renewable energy, and again, you know, bring up some of those myths that are going around at the moment. There's another part of engagement which really does come when you start to prepare your planning application, and that's with the local planning authority. Now, we often get asked, you know, is it worth doing pre-application advice? My personal experience of that is that really pre-application advice only becomes helpful when you've really got something to engage with the local authorities with. If you're just asking them, will you give me planning or not? They're never going to say yes. They're never going to say no, but they'll always say, well, it depends on what your assessments and what your impacts are. Now, often as a developer, you're trying to reduce the risks. You know, you're looking at how can we get this into the planning process and how can we get it out as efficiently as quickly as possible. Now, using pre-app can often slow down that process and also not necessarily reduce that risk. You know, if you're having to do these assessments anyway, you've already put in that money at that point, and then you're then asking the local authority, you know, what they think about the scheme, and at that point you've already committed to the scheme really. And so often we don't really see people going forward with pre-application advice unless there's something exceptional within that area which really would tip the balance. And I think there's a lot to be said for really giving time and effort to discussing the project with the officer and their consultees and stakeholders. You know, often we can look at case officers and you might not necessarily get the resource that you're wanting for the money that you've put in, but ultimately, you know, local authorities are under-resourced, and I think being that voice that they can come to and have a chat with and understand the project is really key for successful plan application. Okay, so I thought I'd just put in here about good design, because what we are seeing in the industry is, you know, there are a lot of fantastic developers out there who are really being quite open and honest with their design evolutions. Now, from a planner's perspective, I find that incredibly helpful because it really does show the local authority exactly where you've started and where you've got to. It should identify the constraints, show how you've utilised them, where you've placed sensitive equipment and why. That can often be influenced by your landscape architects or your noise assessors, and really demonstrating to the local authority and the people that are looking at this, you know, even the local communities, on what measures you've gone to really give the site the best design that it can have. There's a lot to be said for enhancements. I know it's something within the industry that's now really getting a push within all applications, and that is the biodiversity net gains. Again, there's a lot there that can really benefit, you know, from the delivery of the projects, which ultimately takes us to that net zero target. There is a lot to be said for building in flexibility. You know, we are in an industry that's evolving all the time. New technologies coming out. You're having panels that are having a higher wattage than what they had before. All of that needs to be built into your model when you put forward your design. So what we have seen in some applications, and it's something that I would really say that we need to get better at as an industry, is either the local authority is starting to put in, you know, a 25 megawatt solar farm within the site description, or you are having consultants who are openly putting that within the descriptions. I would say that we need to move away from that. You know, the Town and Country Planning Act has a cap of 50 megawatts, so most applications should really be going in 49.9, you know, in there saying this site could achieve up to 49.9, but then actually, you know, really demonstrating what is the current scheme now. So, for instance, you could have a scheme now that is 25 megawatts, but in 5 years' time could actually deliver 35 megawatts because the panel technology that's come in may increase the capacity of the site. So what we would encourage is for, you know, use that cap that's there. You don't have to say it's going to be 49.9, but you can say that the current design is 25 and therefore the benefits are X, Y, Z in terms of your calculations of the home's equivalent. Now, don't put it into your description, because ultimately you're demonstrating the benefits of the scheme in that time. You're not having to put that cap on the future of the project. So that's a really key one, and an opportunity that I think that we've got within the industry to really sort of push and make sure that we do have flexibility. One thing that we're seeing as well is local people during that engagement session may come up to you and say, we used to have a public right of way that ran through the site, that's no longer there because of the legacy of different landowners. Now, there are opportunities, you know, obviously it depends on what your model is, it depends on whether you're able to deliver on that, but there is the odd local opportunity where you may be able to put in a permissive footpath. Now, obviously you do need to be careful how that's managed and make sure that it is not then kept through after the lifetime of the development. So you would have to look at the relevant acts and maybe close the footpath once a year, just so that you keep that permissive footpath as a permissive footpath, which once the solar's then removed, then the landowner isn't left with a public right of way that they have to maintain that they haven't really signed up to. So I kind of touched on it earlier, but in terms of the planning process itself, there are a lot of opportunities and responsibilities for developers moving forward. I think something that we've seen is making sure that there's a proportionate approach to planning, and an example of that is potentially archaeological trenching works. This does come up quite a lot. It's something that councils, if you have submitted a geophysical survey and it does show that there's some sensitivity there, then they may ask you to trench the site pre-determination. Obviously, that's a huge cost for a developer, and that is something that needs to be managed. I think we have a responsibility as an industry to really push back and understand exactly proportionately what needs to be done on site. Some certain authorities will come back and say 4% trenching everywhere. That's not necessarily proportionate to the sensitivities that have been identified on site. If you have a developer who goes forward and agrees to that, the fact is that then every developer that follows will be hit with the same thing, and when they're trying to push back, it'll be a lot harder for them to overcome that if it's shown within the industry that we're just going to accept it. Now, I'm not saying don't do trenching, because everything's got to be proportionate in terms of from a planning authority perspective. But I think as an industry, we do really need to educate and just understand that actually just saying yes to everything sometimes isn't the right answer, and really understanding how we can work together as an industry to make those processes better is something that we really should be doing. Guide and support local authorities, that kind of feeds into what I've just said. Some of them haven't had large scale solar projects before. They've maybe been subject to the 5-10 megawatt schemes. They might be looking at this, and when it lands on their desk, they might feel a little bit worried about the scale and the size and the impacts of the scheme. So it's really important that we work with them. Preparing a robust application goes without saying, but really you are going to shoot yourself in the foot if you try and do something on the cheap. It will come back and bite you. It needs to be proportionate. It needs to be something that the local authority can look at and feel like they can, a responsible developer has come forward and assessed everything that they should have assessed. And now and again, you will have to utilise case law. You may have a local authority who aren't as experienced and maybe don't quite understand how to do the weighing up and the planning balance. It's really helpful just for them to be able to give them some case law and some guidance. We find that does help, because having an inspector tell them how to do something is a lot better than a developer saying we don't agree with you. So there's 3 opportunities that I see really as an industry, from a developer's perspective in the planning system, ways in which that we can really push forward on this net zero target. And that's identifying at an early stage what your project risks are and using them to your advantage. So show the local authority how you've managed those, how you've integrated it into your scheme, and that you've engaged and that you have actually understood what needs to be achieved. Put the time and effort in with the local authorities. They will appreciate that. If you've got a local authority that doesn't really know solar that well, that they will thank you, and the rest of the developers following will thank you as well. And just be mindful of your actions. You know, something that you say yes to now may impact the rest of the pipeline of projects that are coming through. So just think of it as, you know, we're all working towards the same goal. It's not going to be one developer that suddenly pushes us into this net zero target. We've got to do it as a collective. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Yeah, I've got plenty of questions for that one too. Right then, next up, third and final speaker is Robert Miles, who's Chief Executive Officer from Immerser. Robert brings with him a vast amount of experience in the renewable sector, with a particular specialisation in battery storage. He's qualified as a lawyer and involved in the solar industry for over a decade, working throughout Central Europe and the UK. And having worked as head of commercial at British Gas Solar, Robert is currently CEO of this energy storage solutions provider, who have developed over 1.5 gigawatts of battery storage projects. So over to you, Robert.
Morning, everyone. Unlike the organised people before, I don't actually have a slides deck, so it's just going to be me sort of going through some bits and pieces. So just to expand, well, first of all, morning, and nice to see you all, and thank you for taking the time to join this webinar this morning. I think, so with Immerser, we go through all forms of solar and storage development. We also we have Alpha ESS UK, which has now developed or delivered 3,500 installed systems in the UK, predominantly in the small commercial and residential sector. Now, going into what this overall thought is, I thought it may be worthwhile just giving a bit of a background of how the solar industry has developed in the UK, a few points that we mentioned by the other speakers this morning as well, and how we see this moving forwards. As we all know, we had the solar rush back in 2011 with the launching of the solar feed-in tariff and, of course, the renewable obligation certificate, which gave massive drive and security to those developing large-scale utility projects. I'm actually very happy that we are now in a self-sustainable industry. And the question really we have is, how do we develop these further, and how do we have the biggest impact within the UK market? There's been a concentration this morning around the utility projects, but when we're considering developing solar, I think we ought to also be considering the residential sector, commercial, industrial, as well as the utility. Now, the reason I want to bring sort of some reference to this is because there are different planning regulations that affect different applications that are going through. So just by way of background, it's probably worth noting what you are allowed to do, what is deemed permitted development, what falls into what's called prior notification, and then where we see a full planning application. So first of all, to note that permitted development, anything under 50 kilowatt, which I know is a smaller system, but if you're looking at large scale deployment, it's very worth noting. Anything under 50 kilowatt falls under the microgeneration certification scheme, and as such, doesn't need any planning consent to go forward. That is caveated with a couple of situations, one being, for example, with listed building. This is on roof. So if we're talking about roof installed solar, we've got up to 50 kilowatt, which you can go forward without any notification to the planning authority. As I say, do check out planning portal to see those couple of exclusions. 50 kilowatts to 1 megawatt, which obviously is quite a substantial system, also falls within permitted development. However, you are not under an obligation to do what's called prior notification to your local planning authority. And really, that's a form of negative consent. You submit what your intentions are on that property, and if they've not come back within 6 weeks, then you're deemed to have that negative consent. If we step over that megawatt on roof, then we go into full planning. What is quite bizarre, I always thought, is if you're on ground mount solutions, anything over 9 square meters would require full planning consent. So in the world of what that means, it's about 4 kilowatts. So I do think that there's some thought that needs to be going into that. But if you are looking into developing this, and we are looking at how we accelerate it, I do think we need to look, or you guys need to consider what market you're targeting. If you are targeting that market for behind the meter self-generation and you're using rooftops, then that's going to be a far quicker way to get through that planning process under that prior notification. So Kirsty gave a really nice background around that planning process when you're going into that. One thing I may add to what she mentioned there is get a good planning consultant. As she alluded, there are multiple characteristics on multiple different sites, which will take a different view. So it may well be worth, once you've got that first interest, you've identified the land, you've identified the capacity, get a planning consultant that you're friendly with or whom you're looking to work with, just to have a pre-screening review. Is it sat in an area of outstanding natural beauty? It's not unattainable, but you've got to look at those different applications. Are you on an SSIS or the site-specific scientific interest? Consider whether there are any showstoppers from that outset. Then you can go into some further screenings, which would be things like speaking to the archaeology people at heritage around whether it might be a site of interest. The archaeological ecology studies is another really, really important one. You'll hear great crested newts and badgers and the sort. So the reason that you need to consider those is there are only certain times in which those specific consultants can give those reports. Generally, it will be during their hibernation, so either at the beginning or the end of that hibernation. But these are some things that you can overcome or just look at before going too deeply into it, just as a bit of a safety check. So what I'm now going to look at is not just what we're looking around the planning basis, but also what the application, as I said, is you're going into. Now, the purpose of this, we're talking around how we accelerate the solar development in the UK. Quite often, that's obviously considered in line purely with utility scale, where you are building a site, where you are exporting that power and entering into a power purchase agreement with a third-party offtaker. Those are going to be the most challenging sites that you have. If you can incorporate that self-generation for self-consumption, which has got consumption on the point of generation, then you're also going to see a lot more leniency, using that word very carefully, from the planning perspective, because there are planning regs that allow more ability to deploy when you're actually doing this for self-consumption. And point in question would be actually the wind, onshore wind in England, is actually you can get those through planning as long as you've got community engagement and community support and that rationale to have that utilisation for that area. So yeah, be careful of those. Also spoke about pre-applications. We're seeing a lot of pre-applications at the minute that we're not actually getting any responses before we put that full application in. So I would very much agree with Kirsty. They're sort of worth so much. Those conversations with the planners are good, but I think that engagement with a planning consultant or that further depth into local searches might be more beneficial than potentially running that pre-application for the solar. The other things I just wanted to touch on, again around the planning, was, yeah, this government, I'm not going to show any colours, I'm not saying I'm in support of any of the government or any of the political parties right now. There does seem to be a very strange adoption of quite strange policies. I believe Truss was even suggesting that we should increase agricultural land and go into biofuel. When we consider biofuel, you need far more land to create to grow the biofuel than you use for solar. The other one is people aren't looking at biodiversity. There is the ability to utilize solar fields for more than just solar. We have grazing, we have natural habitats which you can push for bees and the sort. So always look at that additional utilization of that land if you are going into the large scale. The other point as well, which Sophie was talking about, was energy storage. So as I say, we work with 3 different technology types. We work with lithium. We're using lithium iron phosphate, which has slightly less risk factors to the nickel magnesium or NMC, nickel magnesium cobalt, which is the one that's always assimilated with the fire. It's because of its thermal runaway. So the phosphate is actually a far more safe application, which the large majority of manufacturers are now going towards. NMC remains the principal one for the automotive trade just because of its density. We are at that teeter point now of short duration and long duration batteries. It's not just purely for that arbitrage and trading point. It's also for those people that are looking to co-locate these different assets. So something that can be considered in line with your solar development is actually, if you do have a constrained grid connection, you can increase your DC connected solar while restricting your AC connected. Now, to explain a little more, it's your inverter from your battery maybe, let's take an arbitrary number of 1 megawatt, which obviously is multipliable through. That 1 megawatt could be put onto a battery. You can actually hold 2 megawatts of solar installed behind that, which would obviously increase your ability to trade. Obviously, you'd have that battery sitting as the buffer and regulating the power flow into the system. Also, if you have behind the meter applications, again, utilizing in line with a battery, you can increase that on-site generation by utilizing that live onto your load, but holding any excess generation in your battery while having that restricted connection, which again gives us the ability to increase the deployment of what is a disruptive generator. Solar is disruptive generation. The problem that we're having, the majority of the problems will be in relation to your grid connection. So if we have the ability to run those generators alongside energy storage, it enables us to control that, increase our deployed installed capacity whilst maintaining a far more stable and reliable power source. The other one in relation to long duration is very interesting, again, around Sophie's part on the pumped hydro. Our second technology that we use is vanadium, which is similar one to what Sophie had used down at the Centrica LEM project. Now, a vanadium flow battery has sort of 30-year unlimited cycle, so full depth of discharge. And when you're considering these alongside each other, very important that it's your feasibility is run alongside with both your initial capital investment, your long-term operational expenditure, giving you that total expenditure and that levelized cost of energy / storage. So do consider those multiple technologies, not just as that initial investment price, but that overall running costs throughout the project life. The capacity sizes. Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, that sort of touches on the majority of what I was looking to say. Please feel free to come back. I would say look at or consider your applications. There's never a one size fits all. Oh, one other thing was the capacity size on the output, which was Kirsty was alluding. When I got into this industry, a 60 cell module was 100 watt peak. We're now seeing the same size module pushing out 400 watts, which means essentially you need a quarter of the space that you used to. So again, that is something very interesting. And when you're looking at the density of your land, you can actually increase your output currently, even with the existing technologies. As I say, I think that covers the main parts of what I wanted to mention today. And I look forward to the Q&A just now. I hope I didn't waffle on too much.
No, you didn't. It was, yeah, really interesting. Thank you very much, Robert. Can I ask all panelists to reappear? Sophie's not showing up just quite yet. Can you hear us, Sophie?
Yeah, I can.
Oh yeah, you've reappeared. Excellent, fantastic. So yeah, we've had a few Q&As as we've been going through. I'll possibly supplement a question here with a further question that I sort of got as we went through. So, I mean, this one's aimed to Kirsty about mentioning the 50 megawatt cap for town and country planning. And should more developments be coming through targeting the actual DCO process? Because if they initially target a 50 or below 50 megawatt generation, we all know that things can change, and the flexibility over the course of a period of time might require or allow it to increase. And would it give them more scope for increased power generation? The supplementary question I would have to that is, with the possible eye on the future and the government's growth agenda, to perhaps make NSIPs a little bit more streamlined and sped up, is there scope for developers to combine forces effectively to submit DCOs on combined applications?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Basically, so we're currently working on the DCO at the moment. DCOs take a lot of time and effort. They really do take a lot longer to go through the process, and there is a bit of a grey area within the industry that I know that the industry is kind of banging the drum and campaigning for, is for that 50 cap to be lifted. Now the problem is where do you lift it to? Because there's a lot of arguments that when you start to get to a site that's producing 500 megawatts, that's taking up a different, much larger area of land than a 50 megawatt site would take, and understandably has a different level of assessment work that needs to be done. It's really tricky. I would love to say let's lift the cap up to 150 megawatts, and then that would then open the marketplace for sites that do sit within that kind of middle area to really be part of a quicker process. Now, that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, and I guess the question around, should you, if you're just tipping over that 50 megawatts, should you then prepare for a DCO? Well, probably your assessment, your feasibility of your financial model on that would probably say no, because it is a lot more money that you have to put into the process. You're not going for a planning permission, you're going for a development consent order, which does involve a legal team. It does involve a lot more work. And so it probably wouldn't be viable doing that. Now, this again goes back to that grey area. There really is an opportunity in the industry for us to figure out what that grey area is and really campaign to shift that 50 megawatts, because no one knows why that 50 megawatts really is there. It's been set at a cap, but it does really restrict development. I think in terms of the reforms and the slimming down of the NSIP process, I guess we'll see how that works in practice. We are working with the local authority that we're doing the DCO with to actually come up with a design guide for solar. And so we're trying to kind of input into that in a positive way for the industry, so that, potentially that might streamline the way that local authorities assess solar farms. But yeah, I would love to say, yes, everyone go forward and build as much solar as possible, but these weird caps on the systems that we find ourselves in does limit that. I think when I mentioned around, making sure that you don't put in the site description 21, 25 megawatt solar farm, it really is exactly what Rob was saying. The panels have increased, and by putting that in your site description, you really, really are shooting yourself in the foot. So stay below that 49.9 is your cap. You've got to stay below that, otherwise you fall into the DCO process. But just look at how you can kind of factor that into your application, really, so that you're not then being tied to not being able to put high wattage of panels on when it comes to that procurement and building out process.
Thank you very much.
It's a very long-winded way of answering your question, Howard. Sorry.
It's a complicated question.
It's a complicated question.
Yeah. I'll ask a different question now to Sophie. There's been a few in the chat, specifically about the density of R19, for instance. But I guess my following up from that is, does it have to be a liquid, for instance? A good old-fashioned kind of a mechanical lifting of weights, for instance.
Yeah. I mean, there are other startups who are working on that, like Gravitricity, are lifting up weights, and they're probably at a similar stage to us. We see this as the most scalable opportunity. Need small hills are everywhere. And looking at the cost stack, pump storage makes up 95% of all the global energy storage. So we want to get on their coattails. So we see that as the biggest opportunity to scale at the pace we need to scale to impact climate change meaningfully in the next decade.
And so presumably as they're smaller, they can go in a lot more places with a lot smaller environmental impacts.
Yeah, exactly. No environmentally benign fluid. We're looking at the circular economy of our fluid, so how we can reuse it or repurpose that fluid for other applications, and then as well as scaling it everywhere, smaller systems, we can build it out in similar timeframes to solar and wind.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Robert, is a question in the chat. With the consideration of all the agricultural issues and building on greenfield, why is the UK we're not trying to cover every single commercial agricultural roof and car park with panels before targeting greenfield sites?
I mean, it's the age-old debate, this one. I think really it comes to a very straight answer, which is yes, if we can develop roof, let's develop roof whenever we can. Sadly, that isn't always an option. We're looking at, for example, a massive utility manufacturing manufacturing company. We're able to put 5 megawatts of solar on their roofs. It's going to reduce their consumption by 8%. So we need to find the other. Also, we've got to look at inclusion. Not everybody has a roof. Not everybody owns a property. When you're looking at urban areas, we can't go and put solar on every single rooftop in London, but we still need to find the ability to generate renewable energy for there. So I think it's not one or the other. I think we need to look at them in combination. I am a full believer on the rooftop. What I would suggest is that looking at the planning regulations, there is encouragement to push rooftop, which I'd alluded to earlier. Megawatt of solar production is, in most places, a lot of power, 1,000, let's say 800 kilowatt peaks per kilowatt installed per year. That's a massive amount, and you can do that with prior notification. So things do lend themselves towards that, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do everything by doing the rooftop. One thing just quickly on Sophie's is, which I didn't mention, so of those 3,500 systems we've operational already in the UK, which are solar and storage, we're already seen as an aggregate 51% reduction on imported electricity from the grid. So if we're doing that reduction of 50%, we're already achieving that, and that's even on residential, commercial, whichever application, and an increased self-consumption to 80% as an aggregate. So that's just sort of wanted to mention that stat, as we already have technology. That's our deployment. It's great to see new ones coming into the market, but let's not always wait for the next best thing. Let's also utilize what's already there and available.
Okay, right. Conscious of time, we've got 5 minutes left. Still, so many more questions in my head. Anyway, a quick fire one. We're talking a lot about solar terrestrial projects, but not much talk about sort of marine floating solar. Has anyone got any thoughts, barriers, opportunities for that in the UK?
Photovoltaic. they got the nickname photovoltaic.
A photovoltaic. Okay, yeah. Let's start with Kirsty.
Oh, well, I guess it's probably going to start to come in with the whole offshore wind. You start to bring in a different level of assessment work that needs to be done. I guess there's ways in which you would have to combat the weight in cleaning panels as well. There's a lot of things to overcome, I think, from a technological as well as from an assessment perspective. It's taken a long time for wind to really sort of, we're now looking at floating wind. There's a lot of technological advances, but yeah, it's probably not quite there yet. But yeah, every idea should be put into the pot. We need to do something to reach net zero. So yeah, it can only be a good thing.
Anything to add, Sophie?
Hi. Yeah, well, I think the technology is there. That there's some really successful high yield projects in particularly in the Nordics. And thinking about floating wind, that's in choppy Atlantic. So you need your lakes, but there's a lot of ground to go, right? In on land at the lowest cost. I think it's when you start to exhaust that, you start to look at other options.
Okay. It was back in 2018, sadly, we were over in Ukraine, met with the energy minister and the minister in charge of rejuvenation for the Chernobyl site. And the idea had been to use the old cooling lakes to install floating photovoltaic. Obviously, that's a sad story, but yeah, it's definitely there. Right application. Probably would put it on the north coast of Cornwall for the waves.
Yeah. There's a right place for everything, I think, and that perhaps isn't there. Okay, finally, right. We'll come straight back to the what I think, I opened with about the proposed reform and planning rules for solar to include 3B as agricultural land. The fact that Secretary of State or DEFRA may unilaterally propose these changes, do we know how much weight that actually carries, or whether it requires further primary legislation or sign off by BEIS, for instance?
Start the conversation with government policy. It's when you look at the farmers. I mean, I think let's go back to the actual landowners, and I'm sure Kirsty has seen this regularly. This industry has actually saved a hell of a lot of farmers from quitting. They are a lot of, sadly, our agricultural industry here is done through love and passion and not through money. And it seems ridiculous that we should be taking away an opportunity for those farmers to sustain their farm and keep it going by having a regular, decent source of income, but still being able to utilize that land for other purposes. I think it's a typical answer of a load of people sat in Westminster without actually getting out there and speaking to people it affects.
Yeah, and I think just to answer the question on how that actually gets put into place, the MPPF at the minute does state that best and most versatile land consists of 1, 2 and 3A. There would have to be an update to obviously the MPPF and that footnote in relation to 3B. But also, let's not forget, sites are going through the system that do have grade 1, grade 2, grade 3A. They are going through the system, and it isn't necessarily the ultimate restriction. It's just a consideration within the planning balance, and that's how it's always been viewed. Now, if they're wanting that to be different, then they're going to have to, bring in some different rules and regulations for everyone to work to. Because at the moment it's seen as an impact, the same way that a heritage impact is looked at in the balance of the benefits of the scheme. And I think there's a lot from an industry perspective that we've got to do to educate, like Rob says, there is a wider picture here. We're not taking away agricultural land. We are grazing these sites, which is still providing food production. We're not stagnating the land, we're not changing its classification, but that seems to have been lost somewhere. in the politics of what's swirling around at the minute. And we are seeing some glimmers that people are potentially pushing back on that in Parliament and saying, why, what's your justification for this? So whether or not it's just a big PR stunt or whether actually there's something behind it, I guess we'll only, time will tell. But I think the industry, is doing the right thing and pushing back and trying to put their foot forward and saying, well, wait a second, you're talking about food security here. If we don't deal with climate change, there isn't going to be any food. Let's look at the bigger picture.
Yeah. Eddie. Okay, I think that unfortunately brings us up to the end of the session today, which is disappointing because I could go on for hours. I think we've barely scratched the surface, but yeah, it's been great to have this conversation and see your presentations and have such fantastic insights from across the industry, really. So Kirsty, Robert, Sophie, I'll say goodbye, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Guys.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks.